morning. I thank Dr. Beckman for this invitation to us. I am Lawrence Reddick. I'm comfortable today if you call me Lawrence. I am probably like the teacher and the members of this class, a Christian called to serve. And I know we live out our callings in different ways. So in living out that calling, I call myself at this point in life a church bureaucrat who tries to be true to the calling and the vision of God as I have received it for that greater calling, and one who encourages others to be true to God's callings in their lives. As David said, I'm a native of Alabama and grew up the first 8 years of my life in public education in segregated schools in Huntsville. And from 9th through 12th grade, I attended integrated schools. I now realize what I did not realize then, that the dream of integration also crushed many of the wealth that African Americans had built up in terms of our values, in paternal-like and maternal-like influences in our public education, and in the bonding of a people of the same race and culture that made us stronger personally, economically, and corporately. There were gains in terms of buildings, buses, materials, classrooms, and a broader vision, but there were also many losses. Many serious Black teachers who had invested in us were treated as if they were not equal enough to serving us in integrated schools. Long established traditions in our schools were not things you could transfer from one school to another, and the camaraderie that Black teachers built among us, such as the days that a teacher whose responsibilities were also great because of the number of students would assign one student who understood to stay during lunch or break time and work with another student who did not yet understand. In our county, Madison County, until I went to integrated school, there was one city high school for all the Blacks and one county high school for all the Blacks. The county school, Council Training School, was where I spent most of my growing up days. And before the country was arguing about busing, we were being bused all across the country, usually in old school buses, some for as much as 1.5 to 2 hours. But I answered the call to preach when I was a young teenager, and from high school in Huntsville, I went to college in Ohio with intentions to go from there to seminary. And from there, I went to Duke Divinity School with intentions to go into a PhD program. While I was accepted into the PhD program in church history and was studying with Stuart Henry, I really only attended the first semester because I withdrew at the close of that semester. It was also a time when my bishop, I am a church bureaucrat, did not believe that person should go immediately from seminary into the PhD program. And my first year of seminary, he also moved me. Not so far away that I could not get to the school, but far enough away that an assignment with the kind of responsibility I had at that church and with my family and with the school, and at that time Duke accepted no part-time students in that program. I believed I had to make a decision between the three, so I withdrew from that program. From there, my life has been primarily that of a pastor and denominational official of some sort. I pastored from 75 to 82 in North Carolina and in Missouri. I had pastored the last 2 years of high school, in fact, in a place called Paint Rock, Alabama. If you know anything about the Scottsboro boys, you might know about Paint Rock. And then I was elected editor of our denominational paper in 1982. It was a responsibility I held for 16 years. But while I was headquartered in Memphis, I also pastored upon request of a couple of bishops, once for 2 years in Holly Springs, Mississippi, and once for 3 years in Birmingham, Alabama. In 1998, I was elected a bishop, and our bishops, after election, are appointed by the General Conference to supervise areas of the church. David has already told you where I went to serve. Let me go to who we are as a denomination. The Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, which was born in 1870 as the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church in America, was the outgrowth of those formerly enslaved persons mentioned by Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner in a previous lecture, who, after slavery had ended, preferred to establish an independent Methodist denomination, I will say now, of our own. The Methodist Episcopal Church South, out of which our church came, was, in my opinion, a church ambivalent about how to treat the African in America, in particular, the African who was enslaved. On one hand, it was a church that had come into existence primarily because of the issue of slavery, in a division from the Methodist Episcopal Church in 1844 and 1845. On the other hand, it attempted to have missions to the enslaved persons and to their masters. We are a church that grew out of those enslaved persons. I've told you that church history was my primary academic interest, or I thought I did. One of the questions at each general conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and in the Methodist Church, we generally have general conference, the delegated body from all of the annual conferences every 4 years. But one of the questions in that ME Church South General Conference was, what shall be done for the religious interests of the colored people? In 1866, after Civil War, the answer to that question was to organize the colored people into their separate annual conferences and call them together as a separate jurisdiction. The word jurisdiction was in the legislation. But after 4 years of that organizing, and with obvious lobbying of formerly enslaved persons in Georgia and Tennessee and other southern states, the senior bishop of the ME Church South, Robert Payne, and Bishop Holland McTeer met in Jackson, Tennessee, with 41 formerly enslaved delegates from, I believe, 8 annual conferences, and formed the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church in America. In particular, they were insistent on not being called the CME Church South, but the CME Church in America. The records usually say that we changed our name to Christian Methodist Episcopal Church in 1954. But because of the technicality of it being considered a constitutional question, all of the annual conferences of the church, at that time about 40 plus, had to vote on the question. And the official date of the change of the name, according to the announcement at the time the vote was certified, was January 19, 1956. I refer you to 3 printed texts. There are other writings about us, but these in particular address the issues of our subject today. One is the history of the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, 1870 to 2009, faithful to the vision. And by the way, I have written each of these in the chat. I hope they are still there. It's by Orr Spragin, S-P-R-A-G-I-N. The other is a work by Raymond R. Somerville, Jr., titled An Ex-Colored Church, Social Activism in the CME Church, 1870 and 1970. The third is the work of Othel H. Lakey, who was considered our historian earlier, which is The History of the CME Church. Spraggins' work is an effort to recapture the fact that justice work was the initial vision of the early Methodists, and to point where traces of that work are evident in the Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, and the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church. This is how he summarizes the legacy of John Wesley and the early Methodist movement in holiness of heart and holiness of witness. The legacy, he says, that John Wesley left calls for a constant desire to fulfill one's life first through salvation by trusting in Christ alone, and secondly through holy living as the Holy Spirit fills the believer with the love of Christ. And that love is expressed in all the believer's relationships with others. He sought to free the Negro slaves of their chains through advocacy and lobbying, to seek the salvation of the lost, both of his own nation and of other nationalities and cultures, through home and foreign missions, to promote education, enlightening the understanding of the uneducated poor by providing schools and affordable literature, assisting prisoners through literacy and employment programs, and comforting those on death row through spiritual counseling, to promote family cohesiveness through devotions for parents and children, discouragement of infidelity, and providing subsidies for those in dire need, to promote healthy entertainment, to promote good government by condemning crimes against humanity and the state, to stop or prevent war through the advocacy of peace, bringing health care to the sick, investment funds to beginning entrepreneurs, and in sum, doing all he could to all, doing all the good he could to all he could, never forgetting that the aim of it all was to spread scriptural holiness throughout the land, which the beginning and the end, of which the beginning and the end was Christ. Spraggan points out how the CME Church has historically tried to be that witness. He mentions the establishment in particular of schools that were high schools and that became four-year colleges. And while there are several, 4 of these colleges yet exist, several had been planted. 4 yet exist as accredited liberal arts colleges in the nation, in Jackson, Tennessee, Birmingham, Alabama, Augusta, Georgia, and Tyler, Texas. When you consider that each of these colleges was founded by formerly enslaved persons between the years 1882 and 1892 and still exist, you see the commitment of the CME Church to empowerment of people with education. Somerville's work goes a step further to speak specifically about the CME's work, the CME Church's work in the founding of schools, but he also talks about the movements of the 20th century and the roles played by CME leaders. For example, he mentions the organization of the women of the church into the Women's Missionary Connectional Council and their cooperative work with the Methodist Episcopal Church South women in developing Bethlehem centers for outreach in Nashville and other places. He mentions the scholars of the 30s and 40s, such as Bertram Doyle of the University of Chicago, but Chicago was his school, president of the Louisville Municipal College, in writing The Etiquette of Race Relations in the South, the teaching of Charles Gomillion, a Payne College graduate and one of our lay members, and a Tuskegee Institute professor who led a selective buy-in campaign, careful not to call it a boycott, and then challenged gerrymandering in Alabama in 1958, and won in the US Supreme Court in 1960 in a case called Gomillion versus Lightfoot. Philip Lightfoot was the mayor of Tuskegee. And the commitment of the denominational leaders and the denomination itself through its general conference by adopting a budget that supported organizations such as the NAACP in the 50s and up to now, and the SCLC by our participation in its membership and by placing support in that budget, and the individual work of persons like Henry Bunton in Memphis, L.H. Welchel, and Nathaniel Lindsay in Birmingham in the civil rights movement. Most CME churches in the 1960s were open to the organizers for mass meetings, especially the churches in Birmingham. Our bishop at the time, E.P. Murchison, would remind us that it was wise for us not to seek to lead all of the organizations, but to make sure we supported them. While I've given a summary of some of the things we have done, I've invited my colleague, Bishop Thomas L. Brown of Atlanta, Georgia, who has more up-to-date presence in the church's roles in the justice movement. He supervises the CME congregations of Georgia, lives in Atlanta, and was a great force, along with others, in the movement that turned out the Black vote in Georgia in 2020 and early 2021. Bishop Brown.
Thank you for this gracious opportunity to come and share with you on this beautiful morning. And thank you for the opportunity to share something of my particular role in the social justice movement. Born and reared in Oakland, Mississippi, which is, in terms of geography, about 70 miles south of Memphis, Tennessee. We call it hill country. But it was there that I first encountered the whole issue of what was then called civil rights movement, later social justice. But encountered that primarily through first my father, who was a farmer and owned his own land there in Oakland, and eventually developed courage to begin to organize Blacks in our county, Yellowbushy County was, to vote. I assisted him as a teenager in traveling across the county, developing, educating, and getting our citizens to vote or to register to vote. I even remember my father and mother voting for the first time, which was a very memorable experience. But I was born in 1951, 4 years before the Emmett Till's tragic death, and in many ways was shaped greatly by the saga around his death. As a young child and teenager growing up in that part of the world, the Emmett Till situation or tragedy became both a source of impetus for us, but also a source of danger or warning of what could happen to us if we got out of line, so to speak. And yet, it, as you know, in terms of the civil rights movement, was an impetus for that movement in many ways, along with other events. But more specifically, my father's role in my county was an empowering experience, because I saw him move from a more passive, non-engaging person in terms of involvement in the whole movement of social justice to that of taking the leadership. I do not know his rationale. He never shared it with me. I think maybe probably because he getting older and the children were at a point where he thought that we could fend for ourselves. But it was he who filed the lawsuit to integrate or desegregate our school system in Yellowbushy County, which included my hometown of Oakland. As a student at Ole Miss, I participated in some protest movements. I was mentored by my pastor, the Reverend Wayne Johnson, who was a colleague with the likes of Aaron Henry, Medgar Evers, and Fannie Lou Hamer. Wayne mentored me primarily in organizing, community organization, I should say, with a focus on mobilizing Black businesses in the Oxford, Mississippi area. And so during my tenure there, I participated with him and learned greatly from him in terms of what goes into organizing persons in our community. Upon my entering seminary at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, I came in contact with Coretta Scott King and the King Center. In fact, the King Center had its first housing in the basement of the Interdenominational Theological Center, and worked briefly with that group in the voter education and voter registration. Also, while a student, in seminary, I pastored for 1 year in a place called Durant, Mississippi, which meant I traveled back and forth from Atlanta to that place, and was blessed in that experience to have a member, Mrs. Johnson, who was a social activist in our community, along with Fannie Lou Hamer and Megha Everett and what have you. I was greatly blessed by her role because here was a woman who had little of any education, but who was a pillar in that community and who made great strides in terms of helping to mobilize that small community of Durant and the surrounding towns in terms of voter education and registration. Later, after seminary, I pastored in Columbus, Georgia for 6 years, and there I became involved in the local chapter of the NACP, became vice president, with a focus primarily on the ongoing desegregation of the Muskogee County school system. At that time, the school system was under court order to desegregate, and continued to resist that order. I participated in protest before the school board and some activity on the streets, protesting their continual resistance. It was my first encounter with the KKK after having grown up in Mississippi, but at least in Columbus, Georgia, I came face to face with the KKK, and there was an article written about with my picture and the KKK beside each other some years ago when I had an afro. And then I was assigned pastor in Atlanta, in the inner city of Atlanta, where I served for 8 years, primarily with a ministry with the homeless, and as an advocate for not only homeless persons, but also working with advocacy for persons who were on death row. And so I spent a good deal of time not only helping our congregation to address the homeless issue, including a breakfast each morning, which was done in partnership with a group called Open Door Community for that 8 years, but also provided transportation for families of prisoners who were housed in places of prisoners who were housed away from Atlanta. So we provided monthly a van to transport families to see their loved ones, and also provided legal services for them to help them address the challenges that their loved ones served were facing in prison. Upon becoming a bishop, I was assigned to Mississippi and Louisiana in 2006, and there did some advocacy work both in Louisiana and Mississippi, primarily in Louisiana, of all places. In Baton Rouge, we had to deal with the continuing efforts of that state to, in its penal system, systematically imprisoning an exorbitant number of Black males. So I participated in the Louisiana Interchurch Conference, advocating for more fair and efforts to make sure that persons who were in prison had opportunities to get to be released and to address the issues that led to their being imprisoned. I did that for 12 years off and on, and in Mississippi, I participated primarily in voter education and registration in Jackson, Mississippi, where I resided. In 2018, I was assigned bishop here in Georgia, and when I arrived in Georgia in 2018, you may recall that Stacey Abrams and present Governor Kemp were in a race for governor, and did participate a little bit in that, but by the time I was settled, that race was ended, and Kemp was elected, but Stacey Abrams' efforts during her campaign mobilized Blacks across the state and others to register and to vote. Stacey Abrams' efforts through Fair Fight has been and is a model for registering persons, educating persons in voting, and mobilizing persons to the polls. I've used that along with other faith leaders in the state to mobilize our pastors across the state, both across denominations, the AME bishop and I, along with some Baptist pastors, made sure that our pastors organized their local congregations primarily through a voter coordinator. Each church was asked to choose a voter coordinator. That person was responsible for not only keeping the pastor informed, the congregation, but to network with us in the communities across the state. They became tremendous liaisons in our efforts to get people out to vote, to register to vote. We focused primarily on those counties and areas where we had a low voter turnout and where in many instances persons had not registered to vote. And that became a very successful venture, as you remember, leading to turning Georgia from red to blue. And then in January, on January 5, we also worked very significantly in the campaigns of Warnock and Ossoff in their efforts to become U.S. senators. And so much of our efforts then was both organizing pastors and congregations to be active in their respective communities, but also to work beyond their communities and work collaboratively to help us pull that off. Since the election of 2000 and 2002, 2012, I'm sorry, last year's election, 2020, we were able to become involved in the protest against the efforts by Republicans in our state who sought to and who succeeded in suppressing the vote or trying to suppress the vote by changing the laws of voting in Georgia. The SB 202 legislation that was passed severely hampered what was then, before then, a very open effort to get people out to vote. We do not know exactly the import of this, impact of this on our voting efforts, but we are already working to make sure that we get our people registered and mobilized in their voting. I was also involved in the protest movement in Georgia, along with others, in trying to keep the Republican state legislature from passing those bills. However, that was not successful. We have continued to work collaboratively to mobilize persons coming up to the next election. We have spent time studying the state, looking at those areas where we have persons who are still not registered and persons who sometimes have been taken off the rolls, trying to make sure that they are properly registered, ID'd so that they can vote, and again, mobilizing our pastors and congregations, our persons register and be ready to vote. We have, for the last 7 to 10 weeks, we have been involved in a weekly Zoom with pastors across the state. We actually have done this regionally, starting in North Georgia, going to Central Georgia, going to East Georgia, West Georgia, and South Georgia, in an effort to make sure that people have a sense of ownership in this effort. And so we have met by Zoom with pastors on Tuesday evenings for an hour or so. One, informing them of what is going on in the state, but also informing them through Senators Warnock and also what's going on in in the U.S. Senate and Congress. These town halls have been gatherings that have mobilized some 700 pastors across the state to be a part of this effort. We are, of course, encountering some challenges because there are persons who have become discouraged because of their concerns around the slow process of the Biden administration passing legislation. And compounding that has been the Ahmaud Arbery trial that is ongoing in Brunswick, Georgia now. We have participated in both protest movements there and continue to be supportive of those persons who are daily protesting in Brunswick. But then in reflection, I just want to say that, as we said to Dr. Beckman the other day, that the Black church is not a monolithic institution. Roughly 5% or less of persons who are active in the social justice movement from the Black church are involved in that movement, I should say. And that is in terms of a public way. That doesn't mean that there aren't efforts being made in local churches, but in terms of public witness, that number is very small. It has always been that way. And so one of the things we are trying to do is to help empower pastors to not work in silos, but to connect with us as a group with our efforts across the state so that we can feel more empowered and a sense of brotherhood and sisterhood in this effort. One of the things I've observed in my journey is that with few exceptions, most pastors and congregations that are involved in social justice movement are not long-standing congregations or pastors, at least in terms of the public witness. In Atlanta, it's been my observation that most of the pastors who are involved in churches are persons who are implants or who moved to Atlanta community in recent years and become leaders in this regard. That many of the persons who were longstanding pastors who served larger congregations really were not involved that extensively in social justice efforts. And so for us, social justice has to be a collaborative effort to, one, learn from each other, but also encourage and support each other in our respective efforts. And social justice inevitably is always somewhat reactionary or in response to issues and circumstances that will prompt our response. I would like to think that the Black church's involvement in social justice is both part of necessity as well as a privilege, but in some instances more out of necessity than privilege. As we have continued to work in this effort, we are faced with the power of social media, which, as you know, in many instances, does not support public theologians or helping persons to bridge the gap between evangelical witness and social justice. So part of what I'm doing in the state with pastors that I work with is that requiring them to read sources that can help us understand our social justice responsibilities. For instance, at this juncture, our lay and clergy are reading William Barber's books, We're Called to Be a Movement and Revive Us Again. It's a way in which we are seeking to make sure that our pastors and parishioners are articulate enough about what their roles are and what their mission is in light of what we're facing in Georgia. And we found this very helpful. In fact, this coming Saturday, we have a Zoom throughout the state involving pastors and laity to discuss these resources and to talk about how they are applicable to their respective situations. Lastly, I would just say that the Black church and social justice is an ongoing effort that requires a great deal of strategy and resiliency. One of the things that we have going for us here in Georgia is our faith group has an expert person on strategizing in terms of social justice. That person meets with us weekly to be kind of an objective voice to help us think about how we're approaching our witness so that it is more effective. But having said that, I will stop, but would certainly say that this has been a tremendous journey and is a tremendous journey. It is one that requires a great deal of courage and does require a good deal of coalitions or correlating and working with persons across denominational lines and beyond the church family. Thank you.